So let me start with a simple question. What does neutrality actually mean in the 21st century? Not in theory, not in history books, but right now, in a world defined by major power competition, regional wars, and the slow erosion of the rules-based order. Because hardly any concept in a Swiss foreign policy is being debated as intensely as neutrality. And yet, most of that debate completely misses the point. Some want to abandon neutrality, others want to romanticize it, but both camps misunderstand its nature. Neutrality is not a moral posture, and it's also not a national personality trait. And it is certainly not an end in itself. Neutrality is an instrument, and instruments only work if they are used, adapted, and politically guided. All right, let's slow it down and unpack it properly. How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, and if you're new here, this channel focuses on European geopolitics, international relations, and statecraft. Consider subscribing if that's your thing. Now, before we go further, I always want to throw the question to you. Do you think Swiss neutrality is still an asset right now? Or is it slowly turning into a constraint? And more importantly, when you look at Ukraine, at the war in Ukraine, for example, when you look at the pressure coming from Europe, from the European Union, from the United States, from Russia, do you think Switzerland can keep playing this careful middle position without losing credibility? Do you think neutrality today still buys Switzerland room to move? Or does it increasingly look like Switzerland is just trying to stay out of trouble? And if we're honest, what does neutrality even mean when the UN Security Council is blocked and the world is sliding into power politics again? Let me know in the comments below. So let's start with the chapter or the first part, neutrality as an instrument, not a dogma. So Swiss neutrality is neither sacrosanct nor static. It didn't fall from the sky. It wasn't written into the Alps. It is the result of historical experience, political choice, and evolving international law. That's why the Federal Council's 1993 neutrality report still matters so much today for Switzerland, because it marked a fundamental shift away from a purely defensive integral neutrality towards what Switzerland officially calls active neutrality, meaning peace promotion, international cooperation, humanitarian engagement, solidarity, etc. And here is the principle that keeps getting lost in public debate. Neutrality is a means or an instrument of Swiss foreign policy and not its purpose. It serves Switzerland's interests, and when applied well, it also serves the international system, which leads to an important implication. Neutrality can and must be politically shaped. That means prioritization, it means judgment calls, it means responsibility. And neutrality, it's not an autopilot. It has always adapted to geopolitical situations around Switzerland. So legally speaking, Switzerland's position is actually quite sober. UN Security Council measures are binding. Neutrality does not apply there. Switzerland may also autonomously adopt non-military coercive measures, including sanctions, even outside the UN framework. Participation in UN-mandated military measures is also possible in principle, for example, through overflight rights, logistics, or support functions, as long as these are proportionate and assessed case by case. Sanctions outside the UN system are permissible under international law and within the limits set by the Hague Convention, on which Switzerland still relies on as a legal framework for its neutrality. And neutrality is not an obstacle to EU's accession. In other words, neutrality is not a legal straitjacket. And that's exactly why the debate since 2022 in Switzerland is so striking, because it's no longer primarily legal, it's also emotional in a way, it's also symbolic. And once neutrality becomes an identity question instead of a strategic one, it becomes, looking from it from a geopolitical standpoint, it also becomes dangerous. So let's look at neutrality and its history. So important to understand, neutrality was not Switzerland's default setting. Depending on how you read history, its roots go back to Mariano in 1515, the eternal peace with France in 1516, or the Swiss Diet's explicit mention of neutrality in 1647. But then comes 1798, French troops occupy Switzerland, and the lesson is brutal in a way. Neutrality alone does not guarantee protection. Only in 1815 is Switzerland's perpetual neutrality recognized under international law. And only in 1907 do the Hague Convention codify for the first time the rights and obligations of neutral states. Switzerland accedes in 1910 and still invokes them today. But neutrality keeps evolving. Differential neutrality during the League of Nations, retreat to integral neutrality after 1938, gradually opening from the 1960s onward. And finally, the 1993 shift to active neutrality. In 1999, for example, Switzerland adopts EU sanctions for the first time. Symbolically, that matters, because it shows neutrality has always been adapted. The idea that neutrality is a frozen doctrine is historically false. So let's go to 2022, a geopolitical break. Russia's invasion of Ukraine marks a decisive turning point, not just for Ukraine, for Europe, because Russia is openly challenging the European security order built on the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris. Power politics are back, violence is back, fears of influence, we can say, are back as well. And globally, another trend is accelerating: transactionalism. International politics as deals, as exchanges, as bargaining, not rules-based cooperation. We are entering a more fragmented, a more competitive world. Some say it will be multipolar, others are seeing a more bifurcated global system. But already clear is that multilateral institutions are struggling. The most visible symbol, the blocked UN Security Council, which forces Switzerland in a deeply uncomfortable question. What happens to neutrality when collective security fails? The Federal Council's answer is legal continuity. When the Security Council cannot act, the law of neutrality applies. Legally coherent? Yes. Politically sufficient? That's another question. So neutrality still enjoys broad domestic support, but it is no longer unquestioned. ETH Zurich data shows a decline from 96% in favor of Swiss neutrality in 2018 to around 81% today. At the same time, Sotomo, another institute, surveys suggest that neutrality and good offices are no longer seen by a majority as Switzerland's defining ideal. Even more striking, a narrow majority supports closer NATO ties. Around a third can imagine joining NATO. That doesn't mean alignment tomorrow, but it tells us something important. The old security policy coordinate system is shifting, and then there is also the moral dimension. Decisions like refusing to deliver protective helmets to Ukraine or the temporary internment of Ukrainian soldiers, they caused international irritation. Critics accused Switzerland of moral coldness, so let's clarify something essential. The law of neutrality under the Hague Conventions is amoral, not immoral. It is functional, values neutral. It does not distinguish between aggressor and victim. That distinction comes from the UN Charter after 1945. Prohibition of force, right to self-defense, collective security. But here's the paradox. It is precisely this amoral structure that enables moral action. Humanitarian aid, protecting power mandates, mediation, evacuations, diplomatic channels, all of these depend on not becoming a party to the war. Neutrality only becomes problematic when it appears morally empty, or worse, economically opportunistic. The current debate is polarized. On one side, the Neutrality Initiative calling for a return to integral neutrality. The risk? Neutrality becomes a dogma. Foreign policy flexibility shrinks. On the other hand, we have the Manifesto 21 in Switzerland calling for rapid adjustment. Its core argument, neutrality should no longer be grounded primarily in a moral Hague law, but in the UN Charter and the Federal Constitution. In practice, this resembles non-alignment, similar to Sweden or Finland before they joined NATO. The majority of international law experts and the Federal Council reject this. Why? Because the Hague Conventions still apply. They are supplemented, not replaced, by the UN Charter. Especially when the Security Council is blocked, they retain regulatory relevance. Neutrality expert Marco Iorio pushes the debate further. He argues that key elements of Swiss practice, especially the strict re-export ban and rigid military equality, are no longer compatible with today's legal order. Since 1945, aggression is outlawed. Victims have a right to self-defense. Treating aggressor and victim identically ignores that development. His conclusion is sharp. Switzerland is not isolated because it is neutral, but because it clings to an understanding of neutrality that is politically hard to justify. Iorio does not argue for abandoning neutrality. He argues for reconceptualizing it, primarily on the basis of the UN Charter. He is especially critical of Switzerland's dependence on the Security Council, because when an aggressor holds a veto, like Russia, Swiss foreign policy space collapses. Neutrality should not be foreign policy autopilot. It requires political responsibility. Between stagnation and rupture lies a third option, a gentle reform logic, not abolition, not nostalgia, development actually. Two adjustments stand out. First, when the Security Council is blocked, Switzerland should rely more explicitly on UN General Assembly positions and OEC assessments, for example, as political reference points. Second, Article 9 of the Hague Conventions, military equality, can be interpreted more flexibly without abandoning the conventions formally. At the same time, Switzerland should deepen cooperation. European security projects like European Sky Shield Initiative, interoperability with NATO, and participation in exercises, even in Article 5 contexts, without, of course, alliance membership. Arms exports, re-exports, and transit issues require pragmatism and not paralysis. But none of this works without one thing: a sober, honest public debate. No moral grandstanding, no nostalgic idealization of neutrality. The coming years will decide whether Swiss neutrality remains a strategic asset or quietly turns into a strategic liability. Whether Switzerland continues to be a credible actor in European security or whether it drifts into irrelevance by hiding behind procedure. Because neutrality only works under one condition, that it is actively shaped. The world still accepts neutrality, but it does not accept neutrality that retreats into legal formalism or uses rules as a shield to avoid responsibility. Switzerland does have real strengths: diplomatic credibility, humanitarian expertise, institutional continuity. And these strengths do not work despite neutrality. They work because neutrality is politically guided. So the question is no longer whether neutrality survives. The question is simpler and harder. Does Switzerland treat neutrality as a slogan or as an instrument? Does it cling to form, or does it accept the burden of strategy in a conflict-ridden world? Because neutrality is not a place of retreat, it is a demanding strategy, one that requires judgment, clarity, and leadership. And that brings me to the question I pose to you. Should Switzerland adapt neutrality to its new world, or should it defend it exactly as it is? Let me know in the comments. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, do give a like and consider subscribing if you want to see more videos like this. And let me know in the comments again your opinions. If you want to support me further with a coffee or being a long-term supporter, links as well down below. See you all next time.